came to Chimney Farm in 1986. I came there in fall of 1986 to read Elizabeth Coatsworth's poems at her funeral. Her daughter Kate wanted to make sure that Elizabeth got the last word at the funeral. So the very last part of the funeral was me reading a couple of Elizabeth's poems. One of which was, the very last poem was a poem that ends personal geography too, and it's a poem that, where she says she's never been one to sit and wait for things to come to her, and she hears something coming down the road, and she thinks she'll go out and meet it and see what it is. And I thought that was a pretty nice way to end. It was a wonderful funeral. She had the minister who came and read from Kabir and Rumi, and it was just this very beautiful, upbeat celebration of an incredible life. And it wasn't a kind of mournful, sad day. It was, and the funeral was at the cemetery. It was in the cemetery up there in the field, and it was a beautiful day. And I've never left. I've been there ever since. So so Beth and I have lived there since 1986. Through Kate's generosity. When Mrs. Coatsworth passed away, there were 6 workhorses living there, and they needed people to kind of move in pretty quickly. And the house was full of everything Henry and Elizabeth had collected over the last 200 years of their lives. And it still is full of all that stuff. But the writer's shack was never in use. It was fallen down when we moved there in '86, and has continued to fall down. So yesterday, Daniel and I called Kate up and asked her some questions about the shack, and the way she remembered it was that it was formerly 2 small outbuildings on top of the hill by the barn, and that one of the Simmons family, she thinks Steve Simmons, came with oxen and moved the 2 pieces down the hill to where it is now, and then the 2 shacks were reassembled as one shack. And if you go into the shack, you can actually see when it turns, you can see where it was cut, and the 2 pieces were put together. She said that she thinks it was Steve, but the Simmonses were great sources of information for her mother, and that the oxen were especially intriguing to her mother. And her mother wrote a book called The Little Haymakers, which features the Simmonses going over to hay at the farm with their oxen, and then taking the oxen down into the lake to cool them off, and teaching the oxen to swim with the kids. And there's a point where the oxen save one of the little children who's floating away on a little raft, and I asked her if that was a true incident. She said, well, no, that's not true. That wasn't true. It's a novel, you know. But she would, Mrs. Coatsworth she would use what was happening around her to come up with these wonderful stories, and she published over 100 kids' books. She published 125 books in her lifetime. She was constantly, and Henry published 20 in his life, 20 and 23, but Daniel and I were talking about, at any one point, Henry would have 1 or 2 books in print, and Elizabeth would have 40 or 50 books in print. So, there was a real, the farm really inspired, and the farm is the muse in this situation. I think that the influence of that place on these 2 really receptive, perceptive, intelligent people, the farm made it possible for a lot of books to come out of that. And they're not necessarily about that place, but being in that place allowed that to happen in a way that was really beautiful. And I think that a lot of credit they were living in a place where, even though they were from away, and they were kind of a little haughty at times, maybe some of them, but and I won't say which one, but they had people around them who were generous and wonderful, and became the story. So the farm is not just about Henry and Elizabeth. Like he was saying, the farm is about the Halls, the farm is about the Rollinses, the farm is about the Olivers, the farm is about the Simmonses. It's about everybody around. So it's a shared story. And one of the things we'd like to do through the Historical Society is to have an oral history of that story. So we had a couple of years ago, we had an evening here where people came and told stories about the farm, and we recorded that. We recorded 2 hours of Dr. Dow talking about the farm before he passed away. We're recording the event today. We'd like to have an oral history of the farm that's not just Henry and Elizabeth, but all the people whose lives interacted with that place. So I'm just throwing that out there. Kate said, please, she wanted me to make sure to read a poem of her mother's today, so that her mother got to speak here. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to read a poem of Kate's too. But this is Elizabeth has a book called Country Poems, and they all pretty much take place at the farm. And this is the very first poem in that book. The genius of this spot is one who loves the sound of loons at night, and heifer bells in the rock pastures chiming in the dark, who loves bobolinks and swallows and the smells of hot small strawberries mixed with meadow flowers, and winds that ruffle slopes of hay, and bright large clouds reflected in transparent water, and apples falling in the dead of night. The genius of this spot is calm and rural, accustomed to the scythe and to the plow, a lover of the barnyard and the haystack, the heavy udder and the fruit-hung bough. Yet there is something more, a grace, a lightness, a hint of danger, darkness of the wood, a savage gravity that suggests this Godhead inherits through his mother Sylvan blood. You can still hear the loons, and you can still hear, fortunately there are still cows at the Vannas, so you can still hear the cows too. I mean, and now we've added to the genius of that spot with the braying of donkeys. And apparently I've heard from people who live across the lake, and they can hear the donkeys as well. So,
I've been eating strawberries today.
And the strawberries today, yes. People have been eating those hot, sweet strawberries. And this is Elizabeth Coatsworth's poem for next month. This is called Angeli. Days when the loons fly and the farm hands hasten at their haying, watching the sky, and the fields sway and blanch to the currents of the wind, and the cowbells sound and die in the juniper pasture, and the lake is fanned into darkness, and the women hurry to dry bright clothes on the line, their skirts whipping. Days when the swallows fly and the grapevines are ruffled to white, my soul remembers it is Maine and July. So you can see, I mean, I think you can hear the farm singing through her. It's the place coming out. And just one more thing. This is Kate writing about her parents' writing styles. And if you read Northern Farm, you notice that all through that book, you never know he has two daughters in the house. They never show up, except at the very front where he sort of mentions them in the dedication. But after that, they're pretty much gone, you know. Which this is called At Home. My mother, that feast of light, always sat down, composed herself, and wrote poetry, hardly reworking any. Just the way she used to tell us that Chinese painters painted. First they sat for days on the hillside watching the rabbits. Then they went home. They set out ink and paper, meditated, and only then picked up their brushes to catch the lift of a rabbit in mid-hop. If it didn't come out, I would throw it away. Oh, she was like a bird that fills a bush with singing. The way that she touched her teacup, the look she gave you as you sat across from her, it was all a kind of essential music. I also remember my father alone at the dining room table, the ink bottle safe in a bowl, his orange-red fountain pen in his big hand. The hand moved slowly back and forth, and the floor below was white with sheets of paper, each carrying a rejected phrase or two, as he struggled all morning to finish just one sentence, like a smith hammering thick and glowing iron, like Jacob wrestling with the astounding angel. There is a difference between 125 books and 20. Some of it is time, you know. For those of you who go to the Writer's Shack today, we do have a guest book down there today, and I'm just asking people to sign it so that we can send it to Kate, and she can look at the names of the people who came down today, and maybe we can have a conversation with her later about some of those names. But thank you all for caring about the book. Thanks for being here.